thanks for sitting down with us, guys. We're missing Jeff this week, which is a bit of a bummer, but this is our post-series podcast. You guys know what we're doing. We've done this a couple times so far. And really all we're doing is, it's really about the nuggets, right? We know that when you sit down for a message, unfortunately these days we try to keep those to 30 minutes, but fortunately for everybody who's sitting in the pews, I suppose. Yeah. But that means for those of us who are nerds and who like to dig into the Bible and who have a lot to say, that there are things that we just decide, we're not going to include that. So we kind of try to take a little bit of time after each series these days to kind of debrief that, to say what are the nuggets that you had to chop from the sermon, and what are the things that just wouldn't have ever fit but are kind of on topic. And I think for this series, we had some really interesting things kind of come up in the middle of it that we didn't anticipate that are worth talking about. So for sure, that's what we're doing. It was interesting. Ryan actually didn't get a chance to preach in this sermon series. He did host a panel, though, of some moms, which was really great. I thought
maybe we would, but we always make a plan and then we change the plan sometimes.
And it was great. I mean, that panel was great. We're missing Jeff, which is a bummer because Jeff had like a 20,000-foot ladder that he climbed on top of and gave everyone a heart attack.
He was up there. People were like, did he sign anything before?
Oh my gosh. It was so funny when he's up there at the top of it, and he's, I mean, for those of you who didn't see the message, right? He was at the top of this massive ladder that we have for facilities as an illustration and just sitting there. And I thought he was going to climb up there and freak us all out and then kind of go to like the top third or fourth rung. He gets straight up at the top and straddles it and just sits there, and he messes with it, and he preaches for like 10 minutes up there. I'm like, when are you going to come down, man?
Seems on brand for
my
Jeff.
Gosh. And then he climbs down, he continues to preach as he's climbing down, and I love that when he's up there he messed with us and he's like, you all want me to get down right now, don't you?
We're all like, yes please.
Yes, absolutely. But so I think we just kind of wanted to dig into that a little bit. David, I know that this series, Strengthen Yourself in the Lord, this really is something that's come out of you and out of your heart. It's fun how each of these series kind of seem to come out of a different one of our hearts as we all sync up to that. But that was kind of your heart from the Lord for the whole year. We talked about that a little bit on the last podcast we did.
Yeah.
But really the hope is that we would strengthen ourselves in the Lord. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and why we're focusing in on that for this year and why that was the case for this last series.
Yeah. Well, that is a bit of a theme that came out of our direction team and all of that for the whole year. The idea of strengthening, finding more strength, but figuring out how to like not be dependent on somebody else for your relationship with the Lord. It's an interesting concept. And I mean, we titled the first one, Don't Strengthen Yourself in Yourself, because it seems like culturally there's a lot of people talking about how to get a better righteousness or a better justice or a better strength or a better truth. But they're all, humanistic ideas which don't really have any real truth in them. Because the truth that we need comes from an outside source, it doesn't come from a human source. So there's some of the wordplay in there. One of the things we wanted to do was trying to find Bible characters. I think we would do books of the Bible. Sometimes we'll do topics, but I thought it would just be a fun kind of break for us to just focus on some characters in the Bible, and particularly Old Testament, even though I did one old and one new. But it was, just the stories of individuals in the Bible, sometimes so fun. So that was a little bit of the framework. And then the backdrop for it, I mean, I'll just read this from the sermon. This was my intro to the whole sermon series, and kind of gives a little insight as to the backdrop of where we were trying to drop this concept in was how tired we are because of living through the COVID-19 pandemic, 2020 political struggles, and 2 years of divisive ideological warfare. It felt a lot like canoeing into the wind. It took incessant corrections to stay straight on course and endless paddle strokes to stay in the same place, let alone make any progress. And now we're getting to the middle of 2022, where we see exhaustion giving way to failed marriages and friendships, failing mental health, and wars and rumors of worse. Whether it's right or not, God only knows, but we all feel we are on the brink of a much more severe societal collapse.
Yeah.
Which is hard to think about, but I
fun
think
line.
It is
That's
true.
Really fun line.
The growing confidence in the incompetence of our leaders, the just keep kicking the can down the road financial policies of the last decades seem like it could blow up in our faces at any moment, and the intentional tearing out and tearing up of the moral fabric, which I believe has led to the good fruit of the last 250 years, is going to take us to a new place. And the Bible gives us lots of warnings about that new place. Yeah. The new place, doing what is right in our own eyes, will take us. So that was kind of the backdrop, and this whole idea of, we definitely, everyone who is paying any attention to their own soul knows they are weakened, knows they need some strength. They need to find something to sustain them in the weight of just life, of marriage, of family, of work, of mental sanity, like whatever it might be. And so that whole idea of we need to find strength. So where are we going to find it? And that's the Lord. I mean, that's obviously what we're doing here at Living Streams Church is we're really trying to point people to Jesus and his strength and his life. But then figuring out how to do that. So I really hope there would be like a practical reality to it. Like, okay, great. I want to be stronger. Great. David in Ziklag, David strengthened himself in the Lord. What does that even mean? And so unpacking it in that first sermon series, it looked like worship. Mm-hmm. The practice of worship was something that David continually, and you can see across his whole life, that practice of basically acknowledging who God is was enough to help David strengthen himself in the Lord. But then the second thing in that message was, in that story, remember he said, "Bring me the ephod." Yeah. That was a fun line to throw out there. And 2022 Central Phoenix, bring me the ephod, which means obviously nothing to us, but it makes everybody laugh. And sure enough, I said that, everybody laughed. I think I was actually...
You said, "Brittany, bring me the ephod," which is really funny.
I was like, I do this all the time in my home. "Brittany, bring me the ephod." But that what that meant in that context, for David was get a priest and get this thing that God has, given to us, this concept and idea of how we can discern what God's will is. And so once he found himself in the will of God, the strength was there. It's not that the Lord isn't ever strong. It's that, we are sometimes on our own because of our own doing. And David was at that time, and coming into Ziklag, he definitely was way off track of where the Lord was wanting him to be. But once he got back in line with the will of the Lord, powered up, then there was strength, and then there was freedom, and then there was victory, and all these things. So so the practicality of that, like, literally just breaks down to worship, and then where are you at in regards to the will of God. So and then each message kind of had some of those too, which was really encouraging.
Well, and I think the week you were preaching to hearing from the Lord is such a big deal. And if you're feeling weak and you don't know where to go, and you're spinning your wheels going into all sorts of different directions, for me in my life, when I remember that sermon when you gave it, I thought, when I need strength, I need to hear from the Lord. Because as soon as that happens, anything that I'm going through finds its proper place in terms of, oh, okay, this is right, this is okay, and any major thing that I've ever gone through in my life, if I don't hear from the Lord, I find myself really tired, because I'm going, I don't know where to go. I'm running over here and I'm running over there. When the Lord's going, no, I want you to go over here, it just helps you. I mean, I think in the world right now, we get so caught up in, can I even do anything about the economic things going on? Well, no, most of those things we have no control over. And we start spinning our wheels in all sorts of areas. But when the Lord calls you to something, it brings this focus to you where you go, oh, okay, I could lean in here. And a lot of people that are tired, they don't know what the Lord's saying. And to just pause enough to go, and you created some space that week, just pause enough to go, okay, Lord, what are you saying right now, so I know where to run?
And it's like consolidating your strength towards one thing. I don't know if it's you, but I remember I think it was Tammy did the study on all of us, like what our brains do. And were you the one that had like super small focus?
Yes.
But like tons of capacity. But you had to remain somewhat focused.
I'm very focused. She said I'm like a surgeon. I like it. And it's true. When my kids were little, I was dangerous. If I got into a project, they could be bleeding and screaming, and I would have I'd have to rip myself out of it and go, what's going on? But
But I think that is like when we can, like, we're just bleeding out strength everywhere until the Lord says, I want you to go and focus on this. And once we can do that, then we're fighting the good fight, and we're not just fighting. Because there's lots of fights out there.
I think you said something that's so incredibly important, and I don't want to miss that. You just talked about, one of the key elements in strengthening ourselves in the Lord is hearing from the Lord. And as you were saying that, I was thinking back, and I was thinking, yes, like that's Like when I'm facing circumstances that are just too much, or I don't know what to do with, or that are just crushing, I've found strength in figuring out how to wait on the Lord. So I want to spend a little bit of time picking at that, because when you say hear from the Lord, I'm putting on the hat of someone, trying to put myself in the shoes of someone who doesn't, work at a church and isn't a pastor or whatever.
Sure.
And we hear this question all the time. Like one of the top probably 5 or 10 questions that you hear from people, especially if they're new in their walk with the Lord, is how do you hear from the Lord?
Yeah.
And how do you know that it's God speaking? And I'm wondering if we could spend a little bit of time just kind of answering that from where I'm sure we all have a unique perspective, and I'm sure we all have a response to that question as we hear it a lot. So maybe like Ryan, could you answer this? How do you hear from the Lord, and how do you know it's the Lord that's speaking?
I think a lot of time listening. And I think there's a lot that goes into an expectation of the Lord speaking. So even when you provide a little space in that sermon, I have to kind of take my mind and focus it on this truth that God wants to speak to me. He wants to make things clear. And I pull up my phone with the notes section or something. I have this expectation that God is going to speak. But I think there's years of getting familiar with the voice of the Lord. That's really important. Years of diving into the Word of God to know about His character provides you a really good foundation. But I've gotten into this place where I can hear the voice of the Lord, and I know that that's what He's saying. Yeah. And it's these moments that you can't make it happen to. Like you have the expectation to hear from the Lord. Sometimes I'll hear something that I don't expect, But recently I was trying to figure out there was something that was going on in my life, and I really needed to hear from the Lord. And for about a month, I didn't hear anything on that subject at all. And I remember I was in a hotel room, and I was getting out of the shower, and I felt like the Lord was like, this is what I want you to do in this next season. It was so clear, and it was not in a moment where I didn't just listen to worship music. I was probably trying not to wake my kids up because we were all in one room, and the Lord spoke so clear, this is what I want you to do in this next season. So much so that I went and grabbed my journal and I wrote it down. I was like, okay, this is a word from the Lord. And it's just trying to cultivate that expectation. One of the books I really love is Hearing the Voice, Brother Lawrence. What is the book?
Practicing
the Presence, yeah. And he talks about how he chose to take all the menial tasks in the group that he was living in. So he's washing dishes, and he said, I started cultivating this expectation that I'm going to hear from the Lord and talk to the Lord all day long. And not that I ever feel like I have fully reached that,
especially doing the dishes.
Yes, exactly. Especially doing the dishes. But cultivating that expectation, if the Lord does want to speak to me, and it may not be the time, and it may not be the thing that I think He's going to speak to me about, but having that ear to heaven, I think is really important.
What about you, David? What did you say to your answer to those? When someone comes and asks you, how do I hear from God, and how do I know that it's God?
Bring me the ephod. That's what I say every single time.
Dalton. Yeah. Get that ephod.
Bring me the ephod.
I have just so many ephods that in my closet, and I just I have an ephod for this and an ephod for that. No, I mean the concept of the ephod is interesting though, because there were certain stones and with the umum and the thummim, again there's a mystery to it. But they would somehow light up. Like one meant light, and one meant like sweetness or brightness or something. And so in my life and some major decisions, I feel like I've tried to use that verse, go out with joy and be led forth with peace, and connecting that with the kind of the lightness and the sweetness or the brightness. Like when the Lord is directing me, when I'm hearing from the Lord about a direction that I'm supposed to go, it's interesting because there comes with that a joy and a peace. And it's not necessarily excitement. It's not necessarily, oh, this is what I wanted. It's not like that, like I'm getting my desire. But I remember actually when I guess I would be about 23 years old, and I was living in Southern Oregon, and I wanted to be in Southern Oregon, and I liked Oregon, and yet everything, I was trying to find a job. I was trying to figure out what to do. I had graduated high school. I'd been in Ireland graduated college, and I'd been in Ireland for 3 months. And Mark Buckley, the founding pastor of Living Streams, was like, hey, why don't you come work with our youth down here? And I was like, ugh, because I had grown up in Phoenix and now I was in Rivers and Green and all this, and I had a lot of friends, and so at that time I just was not into it. Mark flew me down here. I went and spoke at the youth group one time, and it was just like, ugh. Still it was like just the and I felt myself sinking into. I mean, I don't say this lightly, and it was probably super beginning stages, but a depression. All the closed doors, all the uncertainty, not really knowing what I was supposed to do, losing purpose, there in Southern Oregon. And I was sinking, and it was funny. I just finally was like, all right, fine. I'm going to Phoenix. Yeah. And it wasn't like the Lord told me to do that, but there was this confirmation where all of a sudden when I actually said it was like the weight was just started to lift. And and there was this joy and this peace. And again, there wasn't excitement, but there was this joy and this peace. It was like, oh, like that feels different. It was like my prayer landed, or like the Lord's voice kind of like aligned with my heart. And again, I got here and things were fine, but I mean, now I'm really, really glad that the Lord was directing me through closed doors there, and then guiding me through this kind of joy and peace, this lightness that coming to Phoenix represented.
It worked out for me because I was one of those youths.
Oh, that's right.
But I think for me, when I hear that question, when people say, hey, how do you hear from the Lord? How do you know that? So I think some of the things that I like to say on that is, well, one, I think the Lord really does have so many ways that he can speak to us. And I notice if you pay attention to people who are close to the Lord, there seem to be some common things, but then every once in a while someone's like, says like, I hear from the Lord like that. And you're like, I'm never like, wow, that's interesting. Like, that's so different. And I think because the Lord has made each of us differently. And it's kind of like the whole love languages thing, right? Where it's like, this idea that there are different ways that each of us tend to speak and receive love differently. And so when you want to love your wife, you pay attention to the fact that, my wife, for example, one of her main love languages is gifts. It's not mine. I don't care. Gifts like whatever, cool stuff, whatever. But I want to love her, so I speak to her the way that she hears it. So I get her gifts all the time. And I think God knows that we are each uniquely designed because he uniquely designed us. And so he speaks to us in ways that are meaningful to us, in ways that we can hear. But some of those common threads, I think, or what's common for me, I hear a lot of people experience where when I'm hearing from the Lord, oftentimes it kind of sounds like or feels like a thought or an emotion that is somehow supernaturally natural inside of my mind or my heart. And yet, like, you just have a sense that this is not me. It is different from me, and I can, but it's again, that kind of peace that you were talking about, that joy often comes with it. And times, especially the joy sometimes when it's like, I got no right having any joy or peace right now. And yet there's that. So I think that's, to me, oftentimes what the Lord sounds like. It can be a thought or an image, or like I said, a feeling. I know for me personally, when the Lord is being explicitly clear with me and I'm like, wanting to ignore it, my heart will actually start to pound. I remember one of the first times I experienced that, I was sitting at a coffee shop and the Lord was telling me to invade this poor young couple's date and to go say something to them. And I was like sipping my coffee and I'm like, no, like I'm having my coffee, they're having a nice date, like absolutely not. And I literally just felt like my heart was just pounding and I wasn't going to be able to leave without either doing what the Lord is telling me to or having a heart attack. And that's, I don't know, I think that's maybe a unique
felt that
thing
for sure.
Me.
You have that emotional response. There's kind of a unique emotional response from the Lord. And especially if it's like a prophetic, I want you to do this thing right now. That seems to hit me out of left field and I go, oh geez, are you sure right now?
Yeah, like I don't want to. That's, I mean, for me, that's nice because when there's uncertainty, I tend to be able to feel like, okay, God, like, if you're going to have to do that, if I'm going to do this, because otherwise, like, that's too crazy, and maybe that's, and certainly that's,
and maybe it's the people too. Like I hear from the Lord often through Mark Buckley.
Yes.
He's a great, like second only to the Lord. I mean, I feel like he's very prophetic, those kind of prophetic people that you trust, Faith would be another one of those, Faith Cummings on our staff. If I feel like I'm getting a nudge from the Lord in a certain direction, sometimes I'll run it through people that I really, really trust that are listening to the Lord, know? And it does, you're right, it happens in a very unique way for each one of us.
I think a little bit of like a submarine pinging.
Yeah.
It's almost like you send out these things and you're pinging not to get an exact coordinate, but basically to kind of get okay, we have this area is where we need to aim.
Yeah.
Because as we ping, we see the clearance here or whatever.
What's coming back to me?
And I think what you're describing too, it's like, okay, well, I kind of feel like the Lord might be saying this, so I'm gonna go ping it off somebody and see if it comes back, and when they say it sounds the same, or it makes me feel the same, or whatever.
Yeah. And oftentimes I think one of the hardest things to hear from the Lord is, especially when you're looking at your life going, okay, what are you calling me to? In my experience, one of the hardest things to hear from the Lord is, I want you to stay, and especially in your 20s and 30s, it's like you're experimenting a lot. You want to be in Oregon. You're like, Arizona's lame. You're in a job and you feel you have a bad day or week or month or year, and you start going, okay, I'm done. I'm ready to go somewhere else. And then you hear the Lord say, but I want you to stay here, you know? I think for me, it's especially talking about strengthening ourselves in the Lord, it's those times where I feel tempted to give up and go, okay, let's just go somewhere fresh and start something new. And the Lord gives me a renewed strength to just keep doing what I'm doing, which it's hard sometimes to hear that from the Lord. And yet it's so refreshing. I could stay in my same place and go, okay, I have a renewed understanding of why I'm here, or at least a renewed like commitment to staying here because the Lord's spoken it,
Yeah, and when the other thing, I think another important place, I think we hit two of the really good ones, right? You can hear directly from the Lord. You can hear prophetically. Also the word of God. Obviously, for sure, specifically the scriptures, that's a great place to hear from the Lord, because it's literally, it creates a filter for us, right? Yeah. To say, well, I don't know if that thought or that feeling, I'm not sure if I know yet whether that's the Lord or the weird pizza I ate last night. But if it looks like and sounds like what you see in the scripture and the character of God in there, that's a major indication that it is. And if it looks like it doesn't harmonize with that, then you could say, well, that might have been the pizza.
Yes.
And I think maybe the maybe fourth place that I think is easy to define that we might hear from the Lord is in nature, right? There's general revelation. You can look into the world, you can look into mathematics and science and beauty and the sunset and the ocean and, and the universe and all this, and you can see that God is declaring his goodness and speaking his word through those, and that can be apparent to us as we pay attention to those things. And I think the last thing I would say kind of on that topic when it comes to, how do you hear from the Lord? I think is just as important as how do you know it's the Lord, right? And I think particularly in American culture, in Western culture, and other cultures like maybe Japanese culture that are really high strung and really busy, it can be so hard because we're like frenetic, like we're just like so much motion, so much chaos, so much busy, so much noise,
fill all the gaps.
Get in your car, you're in line, you pop in your headphones and you listen to something or play music or a podcast or whatever, like we just don't wait and pause. And it's like, how do we expect to be able to hear God if we can't pause? Because although the Lord does sometimes speak in ways that cause your heart to thump or in the thunder, more often than not it's that still small voice, and he's whispering. And I love this. I don't remember who it was. Someone who came here years ago said this. God is whispering. When someone is shouting, what do they want as relationally with you? They want you to be far away, right? Shouting connotes distance. If I'm yelling at you, I'm saying get out of here, or I'm at least acknowledging a chasm. But when someone whispers, they want you to come close. If you look to your kids and you said, hey, I have a secret, you're wanting them to come right in, and you're probably going to tickle attack them or whatever, you're wanting to draw them in. So the Lord is whispering because he wants us to draw near to him. And so if we're so busy and so loud and we can never hear the whispers, I don't know that we're going to be able to hear him most of the time. And so I think it's vital to learn stillness, silence, solitude, waiting, pause, carve out some time. I actually, just a minute ago, I started doing this thing. An alarm went off on my phone because I started doing this kind of 1 o'clock call to prayer to just remind me. A little alarm goes off on my phone. I got the little heartbeat buzz on there to just pause in the middle of the day because I've been so busy and I'm getting sucked into the American crazy. And it's like I'm just trying to implement a new spiritual discipline to wait for just a little bit.
You need space. You need space in your life. And it's a good parental strategy I've been employing lately. where instead of yelling at my kids, I talk softer, and I think it freaks them out a lot more.
Yeah, well, so we had this interesting thing that happened. I think a little later on we can talk. I have some nuggets from my sermon, but one of a really weird thing happened in my sermon, where it just seemed to me that one of the things that came up as I was prepping for my sermon was maybe to kind of briefly hit on kind of the tragedy and the grief of abortions.
Yeah.
And it's funny, it was just something I remember, for people who don't know, we have this process of kind of giving notes, or I'll actually give kind of a rough recording of my message to you guys and to Jeff and Dan Riccio, one of the guys, one of the elders at our church, and get a little bit of feedback. And I didn't think much of it, but I heard from all three of you, you were like, hey, you can't just like low-key mention that and then not pause on that and not leave some space there. And so I ended up spending more time talking to the Lord about that and processing that. And I think it ended up being, the Lord did some really, really cool stuff on that Sunday.
Yeah.
And that was the Sunday before the Supreme Court leak.
Yeah.
Which was all sorts of weird.
Yeah.
And
Supreme Court leak on Roe v. Wade.
On Roe v. Wade.
Yeah. Well, it's the only Supreme Court leak that's ever happened in the history of, our nation. So that was, I don't know what to do with that.
Well, there's those moments, right, where we're like, church is our job, and sometimes it feels like we know what to do. There's Sunday morning, we have our meeting, we know how to like organize. Obviously, we're praying into our sermon and all of that. This was one of those, just for me, a good reminder of the Lord is with us, because we couldn't have ever known what was going to happen the next week. And I remember we were talking about it, and you said, do you think I should even broach the subject? And I said, I think you should. And I don't know why, but I think you should. And then to have that leak happen the next week, it was like, oh, we've already kind of laid a little bit of a foundation to talk about this. And it's not something that we have talked a ton about in our church. And so it felt a little bit like a very clear moment where the Lord was like, I want you to start engaging into this conversation here. And it's tough. We're always trying to figure out, is this, our church wading into politics, or is politics wading into the church world? And I think this is clearly one of those issues where politics is wading into the church world. It's wading into a moral area where we could talk about it. But statistically, so many women have gone through abortions, and men too are in that equation as well. Like I was telling you, I'm like, as we're talking about it, we have to know that there are people sitting in front of us that have gone through that, and it's really painful. So to pause and say, Lord, give me the right words, because this is a tragedy and it is hard. But if you've gone through it, there's grace for you. There's no sin that Jesus can't redeem. Yeah. But we have to talk about this thing on a societal level that somehow we've said is okay, and we know that it is a tragedy.
I thought what was really felt like it was so very much the Spirit leading us in that kind of Jesus way of like, well, is it option A or B? And he says it's option like 5. It's not even the same. He just throws a wrench in it. And I feel like our society, and certainly our politics, like they present us an A or B, and both of them are just dripping in anger and vitriol. And to some extent, understandably on either side.
Sure.
But what I really felt like, what I think all of us, as we were chatting about it and processing it and hearing from the Lord on it, the Lord was calling us into was not that, but was the reality of like, hey, we're a church and we're pastors and we're a community, and there are hurting people who are really wrestling with grief and painful life circumstances that are all mixed up in this conversation. And I think it's so important that, we spend, some of us probably more than is healthy, a bunch of time listening to these talking heads about politics on YouTube or the news or whatever. And those people, their job is to get you angry, and they are angry. And that's not necessarily healthy, even if it's sometimes over something we should be angry about, because what happens sometimes on these topics is when we forget that there are people involved in these topics, and it's not just a political discourse, then all of a sudden we build walls to them coming to Jesus. So for example, if we talk about abortion and we point out with vitriol and anger, fuming how evil and how wrong and how bad it is and how it's murdering babies, as true as any of that may be, we forget that there are women sitting in the pews who've had an abortion or who are considering it, and that there's grief to be had, and that the church needs to be a safe place. I recently read a book by Nancy Pearcey, who's quickly become one of the authors I respect more than most. Her book called Love Thy Body gets into a lot of things about kind of, sexual identity and ideology and then the truth that comes under and how the Christian worldview actually values the human body more than the secular worldview. Yeah. And she hits a section where she's talking about abortion, and she says one of the most tragic things, I'm totally paraphrasing, don't remember her quote there, but she says one of the most tragic things is that the church is the least safe place for a woman to process the grief of having had an abortion.
Sure.
That so many women in the church have had abortions and they feel horrible about it. Yeah. And no one next to them sitting in the pews has any idea.
Yeah. And even if the church is a safe place, what pop culture and media would tell these women is that the church is not a safe place. Sure. And so we have that uphill battle to prove to somebody, hey, there is redemption for this. Yeah. And that was the thing for us. It's like spurred this initial conversation. And even the story of like, by the time I was my sermon, which I didn't really have a sermon, but I was doing the moms panel for Mother's Day, the Roe v. Wade thing came down right before Mother's Day. And we pained a lot about that. I was sending text messages going, this is what I think I should say. And then I had somebody go, don't say anything about that. It's Mother's Day. Like, let it just be a nice Mother's Day thing. And this is a little bit of the wrestling if you're watching from home, like the wrestling that we go through on a Sunday morning. What should we say? And I felt like this is one of the most major court cases in recent history. And so we should say something about it. We don't need to wallow in it, but the safest place to be in is to be praying for our country in this place of there's division, there's people that can get violent on either side, everything else. But to be able to call that out and say, let's pray for our country, that we can all get not just a change in law, but a change in heart for our community and for our country to say, no, we value life because God created it that way. But then on top of that, I had a woman on the panel that I didn't pick because of this at all. It was just somebody who had a really great story. We had a great connection. Jen Bishop was on the panel, and she, in her story of not being able to have children, eventually started working for Choices Pregnancy Center. And she had this beautiful story of going, the pain of not being able to have children, for some reason, led her into this place where she's ministering to women who have had abortions or are about to get an abortion. And there was something strangely in that, like in the Spirit of God, that made sense to me. And to have her to be able to talk to that speaks a lot louder than, you know, anything that I could have said on that morning.
No, and I think you said something that was really, really important to hone in a little bit too. The church is a lot safer than it seems. And I think what I was trying to say is that the way we talk about it will might confuse people into thinking that we're less safe than we are. Yeah. You know, the way you hear someone politically engaging in political discourse within the church about abortion might make you think that person's not safe to admit that I've had an abortion too. Yeah. But I think you would be shocked to find that they would be incredibly safe, that you would find comfort and solace, and that they would grieve with you more often than not. Yeah. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't people in the church who would respond very un-Jesus-like in that space, but
most of the people that I know that really do love Jesus, they're a safe place.
But it's an important warning for us to remember that the way we engage in political discourse also affects our capacity to minister to people who are involved in those issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and in your message, what I liked was abortion was, especially at that time before the Supreme Court leak, like you were teaching something, and then you were using this one example of abortion as that. And you were talking about the triumph or the tragedy, you know. So from some people, they look at the ability to escape the consequence of a sin, like a sexual immorality sin that, you know, bears a child. That's a triumph. Yeah. That now, in some ways, our scientific, our humanistic power has now removed a consequence. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, it's so hard to say that a child is a consequence, but I think everyone can understand the challenge of that. And so someone might be getting an abortion to avoid the lasting ramification of a sexual sin. Yeah. And so you were just trying to say, hey, we've got to come all the way back to the beginning, where we're not having an argument down this road right now. Obviously, there are things to decide and there are challenges because people have gone down roads. But if you start at the very beginning of the road, it's Jesus is warning us and challenging us, about sin because there are consequences, and it is not a triumph to sin and not have a consequence. That's actually a tragedy. Because the consequences are there to bring us back to the Lord. And all these things. So I mean that was just it was a great point, and it was heart-wrenching a bit. Because we've all sinned. We've all had to go to a place. And someone told me one time that you can pick your sin, but you don't get to pick the consequence. And that's like one of the most ominous things in the world. But to deepen that even further is you can pick your sin, but you can't pick your consequence. And the truth is you can't pick who suffers the consequence either. Because oftentimes our sin does more damage to those around us than it even does to ourselves. And in the case of abortion, the damage that is done, obviously there's damage done to people that are involved, but the taking of a life is a damage that, you didn't intend for your child to suffer the consequence of your sin, but you don't get to choose who suffers. And that's where the tragedy of it all is. But you pause in that moment to say, it doesn't matter where you are on side of this issue. It doesn't matter where you are inside of your experience with this. If you're, thinking about abortion, if you've had an abortion, if you've had multiple abortions, and you paused right there to speak the gospel, the good news to all those people, and you even prayed, you paused for a minute and prayed. And that was just what's so beautiful is we've got to uphold the truth. We've got to heed the warnings of scriptures, but then we also have grace on the other side because we've all fallen short. That was so beautiful. But then that's what was so unique about it was then the next day, as you had used this as an example, all of a sudden the whole world was talking about what you would use an example as far as
was it the next
abortion.
day?
Yeah, I think it was
like the next day or two.
It was definitely before Tuesday. I think it was Monday. It may have even been that night.
But then sitting with you, that's what was so fascinating. It was like, okay, Ryan, Alec took a gamble, feeling prompted by the Spirit to use this as an example to preach something that was important, and he did it delicately. And then the next day, this whole thing is erupted, and that was what was so crazy. And it's Mother's Day, and Mother's Day is coming. And so, I think that's, engaging in society's pain is a big tenet of our church. And so that was what you tried to do was say, okay, well, we want to be truth. We want to be about the truth and what is good and what is right, but we also want to engage in the pain. And so you're able to do that. And I'm excited because, this is a little preview, but we're hoping one day to have Diana Herman.
Yes.
You had to do a podcast.
I was going to say that,
It's so important because
I think we need to do a long form discussion about
she's OBGYN.
Yeah.
She's had an abortion.
Yep.
She's ministered to people at that point. She's very, very pro-life, extremely pro-life at this point because she's lived it. She's breathed it. She's educated it. She's just been down that whole gamut.
Yeah.
So I think that will be so fascinating, especially as this continues to snowball in our
We want to do a
culture.
long form conversation because I think it warrants it, But I think ultimately, I find myself again going, we're not trying to make a political stance. And we know there's something unique about abortion, but then even on a communication level, but what is it? What is it that's unique about this thing? And for me, even going to Jeremiah, the Lord called Jeremiah even in the womb. And David going, you knit me together in my mother's womb. There's something so purposeful about life. At the end of the day, any of the schemes of the enemy come down to steal, kill, and destroy. And to me, I go, this life issue, whether it's preborn life or not, it's even a value of your own life of going, I had purpose before I was even knit together. Like, how amazing is that? There's nothing else, no other philosophy in the world that can give you that sort of purpose in your life of understanding. You're created on purpose, and you were knit together before you even took your first breath. Yeah. And to me, I think that's where we land, where it's like, we're not trying to make a political issue here, but we're trying to elevate the value of the life of a human being, not just the unborn life of the human being, but ourselves. And I think there is this, and I don't want to go go down too far on this tangent, but in a culture that is very pro-choice, what we would call it, it starts to not just devalue that life, it starts to devalue your own life. Mm-hmm. And there starts to become more and more of then why am I even here? If I was just at the whim of my mom to choose or not choose, it affects us too that are here and breathing on earth. Yeah. And just coming back to that idea that the Lord cares very much about each one of us and has designed us on purpose.
Yeah. That's one of the things actually on what you were bringing up for my message that I had a little nugget that I wanted to share, but didn't quite, needed to keep things tight. Yeah. But I wanted to go into a little bit more the fact that it's like there are these secondary, and I might have said it in one of the services, I can't remember, but there are these secondary and tertiary consequences. Mm-hmm. And the further down the line you get in consequences for your sin, the less obvious that the root is the sin. Yeah. Right? So when you, when you talk about the obvious consequences of sexual immorality might be like a child you didn't expect or an STD or something like that, but if you deal with those, well, now you've gotten rid of the primary consequences, but the secondary consequences might be something like instability in your relationship, right? If you are in a relationship where you've been sleeping together without a covenant, you might not realize that the fact that you're constantly jealous and constantly afraid of any single person who could possibly be a threat to that relationship, you might not realize that that's because you've actually been sleeping with each other outside of the covenant of marriage. Yeah. Because if you can say to your loved one, hey, you and I, we remained faithful to each other and to the Lord before we were married, we chose not to sleep together. Mm-hmm. And so now 10 years down the road when we're married and there's, a coworker that's more attractive to me and we happen to be having a hard time in our marriage at this particular moment in time, I'm not threatened because you didn't sleep, although you loved me passionately, you didn't sleep with me before there was a covenant. So I have that much more evidence that tells me that you won't sleep with that coworker without a covenant. Now that doesn't mean that you can't still, but I don't have evidence, but it reverse that, and we've been sleeping before we were married. Now all of a sudden we're in this scenario 10 years down the road, there's this coworker. I now have evidence that tells me you very well might sleep with that person.
Sure. Yeah.
And then it gets tertiary consequences, your kids growing up in an unstable home because you and your spouse are scared of what's going to happen in your marriage, and then it just goes on and on and on down.
And societal
and you can't trace it back to the root cause. It's like having a weird disease that's got weird stuff going on, and you need Dr. House to figure out where it came from because you've done such a good job masking the obvious symptoms.
Well, and it all boils back down to Genesis, right? Did God really say that? And ultimately, I think that's like when we're looking at sin and the various consequences that happen of it, you have to be able to see it for what it is, and it's from the enemy. And like I said, to steal, kill, and destroy is the ultimate goal of the enemy. I don't care what sin it is that you're operating in. It is designed to take you down. Yeah. And the enemy is real sneaky in the way he does it. He's like, did God really say that? But we got to know that not only in your life and in your kids' lives, but you fast forward a few generations and it starts to have a societal effect. And you see that at play now. I'm convinced anytime I run into something, I'm like, how did we get here? Well, I know. I could probably trace it all the way back, and it's like a Genesis chapter 3 sort of situation. But it's like, it feels confusing. How did we get here? How did we get to the place where people are walking into stores and just stealing everything and they think it's okay? And it seems so confusing. Like, what laws can we pass? But at the end of the day, it has a moral root to it, and you can't control the consequences of that moral root.
The moral root, the moral fabric of our nation is just such an interesting state right now. But on the abortion issue, Diana's just been so helpful because she's so pro-mom. She's given her life to OBGYN and study there. She's so pro-mom. She's so pro-baby. Yes. She's so pro-baby. She's so pro, truth. She's pro-grace. She's pro-forgiveness. She's pro-getting involved. She's pro-education. She's pro-legislation. She's pro-everything. She's just like, this is a very important issue, right? This is a familial, this is an identity issue that, that people just need a lot of help, a lot of love, and there's complications, no doubt about it. But it's been so fun to kind of listen. She's my aunt, by the way, so I got the inside.
And we'll unpack more of that because I talked to her on the phone for like a half an hour. I was like, we've got to do a podcast with you because this is awesome. Yeah.
And at the end of the day, we're a bunch of dudes, so it's great to have my voice from there. But I thought, Alec, you handled it well, and then the response after the service So even though you had a response right in the middle of the service, which was unique, there was a response out. Like if you'd like to come forward for prayer. And again, I don't know everyone's story, but there were definitely ladies up front in tears, getting ministered to, proving that the church was a very safe place for them to come forward in that moment. And we got a lot more work to do as a church for sure.
I guess while we're still on that message, because that's what I mean. I got the nerdy things, you know what I mean. And Judges
is with the Samson.
I feel like every time I preach, I say this is the best book of the Bible. You know, this is just. I'm working on my message on Job, and it's coming out of my mouth, I'm sure, on Sunday, because it's just, but the Bible really, it's beautiful.
It really is.
It really is like it. And like, even if I didn't know and love Jesus, you know what I mean? And I was just like a literature nerd, you know? And the book of Judges is no exception in that. It has these layers, and I was able to hit on that a good amount with kind of these weird patterns that are just beautiful that happen with the word ayin for eye, and, you know, with the word ra'ah for evil, and ra, which means to see. Cool. It's just, I flipped those words, but I mean, it's just, it's absolutely nuts what happens there, that these patterns of these words happen. And so the idea in the book of Judges is that the author of Judges wove eyesight and vision into every corner, every nook and cranny of every nook and cranny of the book. And it's absolutely beautiful. And so I talked about how that culminates in Samson, right? You have this theme of, you know, everyone did was evil in the eyes of the Lord, and that word evil, right? It actually sounds like the word for to see.
Or was right in their own eyes.
Yeah, which is nuts. Right. And everyone did they did what was right in their own eyes is when it gets to the worst, right? And then it culminates. There's actually this arc I didn't get to spell out that I think is beautiful, because the Judges in the book of Judges, the way they're composed, they actually start with Judges where there's nothing wrong with them as far as of course they're not perfect human beings. But Othniel, the first judge that we hear about, I think his name means like lion or something like that. And there's nothing, we don't hear a lot about him, but there's nothing negative to say about him at all. And then as we progress, we get judges who have something that is wrong in the eyes of society, but not in the Lord, right? So we have Ehud, who's left-handed, which, you know, that's your wiping hand, you know, back then, so it's a problem.
Sorry, left-handed people.
I know, it's a thing. But there's nothing wrong with that, but there's something very wrong in the eyes of society. And then we have Deborah, right, who's a woman, nothing wrong in the eyes of the Lord, but something wrong in the eyes of society there. And then we progress on, and we get Gideon, who's like kind of in the middle there, like God's calling, you know, the angel of the Lord is calling him like a, you know, mighty, valiant man, but he's hiding, you know, and he's like very unsure.
He's the least of all the tribes.
And he's just kind of a bit of a weenie, you know, but the Lord's using him, and there's nothing really wrong with that. The Lord strengthens him or whatever. But then we end up with Jephthah, right, who's the son of a prostitute, so something wrong in the eyes of society, but not wrong in the eyes of the Lord. But then he starts doing some weird stuff, right? He actually names one of his kids, "My father is the king." Like, he's kind of vying for kinghood. And he's got this band of like sketchy guys that he uses to leverage things for control of the nation of Israel. And then the most tragic thing happens, right? This is probably the part of the story from Jephthah that we remember, right? He says, it tells the Lord, if I go win this war, you know, and I come back, he says, I'm gonna make a sacrifice. And I don't know if you remember what he says that I'm gonna sacrifice, but he says, I'll sacrifice the first thing I see when I come home. And so what happens? His daughter meets him. And she's the first thing he sees, and the author just kind of leaves an ellipses there, just kind of cuts to black. You know, we don't hear it happens. Said that he sacrifices his daughter, but to be honest, when I look at it, I think he does. And I think the author just doesn't. It's like, I just can't show that.
You can't even
write that. You know, and I think what the author is showing us is things are getting worse and worse and worse, and now we have a judge who in some ways is doing the will of the Lord, but in other ways is profoundly confused about the character of God. God did not say to do this. God did not desire that. He did not bless it. It is crystal clear throughout the entirety of Scripture. This is not a good thing. And then after this guy, we get Samson, who does nothing right, who is just a bad dude. And then after him, it gets even worse. I mean, we have stories that include sexual assault and murder and civil war, and it's just it's dark and it's gross after Samson. But one thing I think that was kind of interesting to talk about, when you were giving me feedback on my message, we had a little bit of a disagreement that I said, well, this is fun, like let's put a pin in this and save it for the podcast. But at the end of Samson's life, right, he gets his eyes gouged out, again holding with that theme. And he's taken to the temple of Dagon, the Philistine god, right? And then Samson cries out to the Lord. and repents in some way. But then he says to the Lord, he says, I'm trying to remember the exact quote, but he basically says, Lord, would you give me strength again so that I can be avenged for my eyes? And the little disagreement we had was, I think it's solid to say that there was some repentance there, but I remember that, and I don't remember where in the Old Testament, but it says very explicitly, very clearly, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. And so I think my take is that even in his repentance, Samson was still off. Obviously, the Lord heard him, and I think that the beautiful message there is that no matter how messed up you are, and even if your motives are a little bit yucky and mixed, the Lord will still hear you. But even in that moment, it was vengeance. It's questionable. He was going for, and not justice, and not what the Lord was doing. And
what was your take, David?
Well, the idea for me was he was saying that in that moment Samson was wrong or was tainted. And again, obviously that's totally possible. But the whole culmination of the story to me was his hair was growing again. So he was honoring the Lord with that. And I don't know if he had much choice. He couldn't see. But again, the author's using these things to say that something was happening between Samson and the Lord. And even to the point at that moment where he says that prayer, Lord, strengthen me so that I can bring a vengeance from my eyes. The whole call of God upon Samson's life was to defeat the Philistines. That's the whole book of Judges, actually more than just Judges, but the people of God were not meant to be slaves to those who are not the people of God. And so, David kills Goliath, who's a Philistine, and now Samson is kind of carrying up that whole thing. And the call on Samson's life is to set the Israelites free from the oppression of the Philistines. And Samson does so in part, little bits here and there. He beats up 30 Philistines and takes their clothes because they have to pay off a debt. He kills 1,000 Philistines with the donkey's jawbone. And again, this is harsh and crass to our ears to hear about all this killing. And I totally understand that. But contextually back then in the dog-eat-dog world, like it was kill or be killed. And we're talking about people who were truly enslaved, and many of them had been killed by the Philistines. And now in order to right that ship, there was bloodshed. And so anyways, that's a tricky thing. But you just have these stories throughout Samson's life. So ultimately, Samson was now, in my opinion, back on track. He was back in line with the will of God for his life. And the vengeance thing, I don't know if his prayer was 100% perfect, but he knew that God was wanting to bring vengeance, to bring justice to the people of Israel, and God wanted to use him to do it. And so in that prayer, I think he was actually, in line with the Lord's heart, praying a prayer that God felt like he could answer. And then the proof of that is that he had the strength. So ultimately, it wasn't Samson that killed the Philistines. It was the strengthening of the Lord that allowed him to push those pillars out, that created the opportunity to defeat, the upper echelon, the ruling class of the Philistines in that moment. And so again, I think there's in Samson's whole story, and I love what you were saying about Judges, like kind of building up for it's like a little cleaner triumph to messier and messier triumph, to where we're not even sure if this is triumph or tragedy anymore, because that's what happens when we do what is right in our own eyes. We just get way off. But I do think the author is trying to say Samson was off from day one, but even in his brokenness, even in his blindness, even in his weakness, even in his bondage, his hair began to grow. Was saying like something was happening between him and his heart, and then the power of the Lord was released to do that.
This is one thing I love about our team, and just for anybody listening, they obviously are doing a deep dive into this thing, but behind the scenes for us, and this is what I love for teaching team, like there's a lot of this that happens, we're diving into something and we don't always fully agree on everything, but it's fun conversation. We're wrestling around with it, and I think that's what ultimately makes the sermons better after we did some wrestling, but occasionally there's things like this where you go, well, I don't know, it could have been this way, it could have been that way,
splitting some hairs.
We're splitting some hairs. I don't think Jephthah killed his daughter either, because the virgins continued to visit her. But anyway.
Okay, all right.
Well, but I agree. I think the point.
Let's break fellowship.
I think that's why for me, where I'm like, I lean more towards it was because it's really, we're splitting a tiniest qualitative hair.
Sure.
Because the point is that in all of his mess, God is still, yes, like I'm going to use you. And
the truth that you draw from that is what's important. Right?
Yes, exactly.
The nuance, obviously, none of us know.
Yeah.
We're trying to interpret an extremely ancient text that's been passed down through multiple translations and multiple generations to us, and we're guessing at the intention of the author. So we have that's the careful work that we have to do. That's the fun work that we get to do, kind of like on our own and in these things. But when it comes to actually declaring, this is what we know the Lord is saying out of this. That's where you nailed it on.
When you can compare it to the man who comes to Jesus and says, "I believe, help my unbelief." Does God hear an imperfect repentance? Does it God hear when you know that, like, when you can even see, or even when you can't see, that in your heart your motives aren't all lined up the way they should be, but there's just a little bit that's right where God needs it. So does Samson repent in that moment? Yeah, by some sliver of a definition, absolutely. And is that enough? Yeah, apparently that's how merciful and gracious
That's
God
the good
is.
news of the Bible too. It's like, it is not a whitewashed book with a bunch of perfect people.
No.
And in some ways it's kind of makes our job hard when we're wrestling around with it, like going, okay, was this right or that? But at the end of the day, I mean, that's the thing that's so beautiful about it. You go, well, am I imperfect too? Absolutely. And this gives me a lot of hope that God could use somebody like that.
Does the sermon that I'm preaching right now leave a lot of questions in a lot of people's minds?
Yes.
Just like those Bible writers.
Yes, and that's the thing. It's like, we're going through Job, and I'm going to be so careful not to talk about Job because I have so much to say about it. We'll save it for next time. But it's a very imperfect, sort of, not imperfect, how do I want to say it? It's a very real story with theological points that create a lot of tension. And some of those things you go, well, if God didn't want any tension at all, he could have made this a lot cleaner and a lot easier. And yet he felt like it was the best way to communicate his heart to humans, to create some, like, I don't really know, I'm wrestling around with that,
It's
and
funny.
that's good.
And after Jeff's message on the last week when he was on the ladder and all those things, he mentioned something in there about President Biden. I can't remember what it was. I actually don't even remember what it was. But Jeff, we all know Jeff is very, moderate. He's really pro, Democrat, Republican. Like, he's very careful about all of that. He's very, he's not one way or the other. He's not real strong one way or another. He's got his ideas, but he's very, very considerate in that. But when he said that, I got an email. I got an email. David Stockton got an email and said, "Hey, when you preached on Sunday, you said this." So first of all, it wasn't me, but I still take the heat somehow.
Sure.
And they were saying, when you said this, it just, all of my kind of antenna went up, that you were very, I think in this one it was, you're against Biden, or like and they were just saying, is this a little politically charged church? And this is my first Sunday, and it felt like you were kind of, speaking bad about a certain side of a political party. And it was just so funny because my email was fun. I was like, well, I'm not quite sure how to say this, but that wasn't me. And secondly, that's not what he was intending. And thirdly, I copied Jeff on it, so he got.
When you're communicating, and we're all keenly aware of that, you're like, when you use that word, what did you mean by that word? And some of that is a call for us to make sure that we're above board in terms of being so careful in how we communicate. But sometimes you can't quite control how somebody reads through a word, and you've got to unpack that a little bit more. And in this, just like you were saying, this very charged environment we're in, it's so tough. People throw it out immediately like, I know what you're saying. And you go, well, I don't even know if I was fully aware of what I was trying to say here.
That's why people think I'm joking, and they laugh every time, and that's nice. But I'm like, on this one, I'm going to say something, and go ahead, feel free to email me afterwards, because I know this, know this one can be misconstrued.
Yes.
There's all these other things I don't even know if they can be misconstrued, but email me on those.
Queue up the email, write problem with sermon in the subject line, and then I'll say my thing.
And as long as someone is saying, hey, this hit me this way, and I just want to unpack that a little bit, and not saying, oh, you big this or that, or like, it's like, come on. I mean, obviously find out first if I said what you thought I said, and then you can blow me out. At that point you could start firing, but at least check first. And so I love those emails when they come, they're like, okay, I heard this, and it kind of made me think this, and is this what you were saying or intended?
Yes,
and I'll tell the truth. I mean, I'll be like, that's what I intended. And then fire away. I don't care. But just don't, you can't fire first.
It's the assuming you know what someone's motivations are that are always so hard. And it's tough. That's part of what we do, right? We're communicating and we're inviting people to say they think, and hopefully we're communicating what we're intending.
And assume we miscommunicate.
But assume that we miscommunicated. At least ask the questions. Give us the chance to talk about it. Yeah.
So, Ryan, I'm curious if there was anything, again, you like, just the schedule ended. You didn't have, you didn't end up getting slotted in for a sermon on here. But again, you did have that panel that was really powerful. And you put like you already mentioned, you put a lot of thought into that panel, which is so interesting. It's funny how sometimes you do something and people are like, oh, this will be easier, but it's like, actually it's
I was exhausted that day.
It's more work to make sure, especially in light of what I handed you and all that. But
it's one thing to worry about how you're going to say something. It's another one to set somebody else up and go, I don't know how they're going to say this.
Let alone there's three of them.
Let alone all of us. I think the moms panel we call it the Resilient Moms panel, and we tried to find people that didn't just have a perfect story. So Faith Cummings has talked a lot about her divorce and her husband who was abusive, and so for her to come through that and then come out on the other side, I think we're always going through life and we hit these tragedies and we go, do I decide to lean more into the Lord or do I decide to walk away from the Lord? And Faith is one of those people that just lean more into the Lord, and her story of she went to Fuller, and she's more educated than a lot of us on staff when it comes to theology. But the pain of her kids not knowing the Lord, and how that hit her, and then to hear like those moments when her kids started coming back to the Lord, and how exciting that was. But the resiliency of people that have gone through those sort of things, and Sarah, who I think represents a lot of us that are parents right now, we're trying to figure out, do I keep sending my kids to public school? Do I not? There's these real questions, these real like wrestling with culture, with the Lord, with our spouse, going, okay, what should we do here? And so I enjoyed hearing stories. We could talk a lot about how you strengthen yourself in the Lord, but until you go through that thing and you come out the other side, it's all theory, And to hear them, how they walked through that, and Jen Bishop, to her story of infertility and all of that, was really, really powerful. But I think it's funny, before we decided to do the panel, I was thinking I was going to preach on Joseph, who I joke is like my spirit animal in the Bible. Like I feel like there's something about Joseph that I go, I've just always really connected with him, But I think one of these things when we're talking about strengthening ourselves in the Lord, and this is the one thing that I probably left on the table and we didn't get to talk about because I didn't talk about Joseph, but when you look at the life of Joseph, there is this steadfastness to him, this stubbornness to keep coming to the table that I think is so important for us. I'm working with a guy right now who's battling alcoholism a lot, and he's on the wagon and off the wagon, and we're working through that. One of the things I told him the other day, I said, good job, that I'm so proud that you keep coming back to the table, that you don't just hide and walk away, but you pick up the phone and you call, even if you're drunk, even if you're embarrassed, no matter what, you just keep coming back to the table. And Joseph is one of these guys where you just see his life, and God calls him to something big that's audacious. It doesn't make sense. And maybe in his youth, he communicates it in a way that's not real great. I don't know. It doesn't sound like it was a great way to communicate it. But his family gets very insecure and all these things. But when Joseph finds himself in slavery, he does everything as if it's unto the Lord. Even when it shows no upward mobility, it makes no sense at all. He just steadfastly, and with faith, I believe, this faithful move of saying, nobody else sees it, but my faith in God tells me that God sees it, even if nobody else does. And then falsely accused of these things, all these things, like you just see Joseph's life. As soon as he gets this big calling, his life is thrown basically down the proverbial toilet for a long time. But he stayed steadfast and kept coming back to the table. And I think for us, there's obviously like people are looking for practical things. So, reading the word, staying in fellowship, cultivating worship in your life. All of these things are really, really good. But in all of our lives, we will hit this moment where we go, I'm not feeling it anymore. I don't understand. This makes no sense. This closeness to God I'm feeling like is not very close right now. And maybe you go through all the list of things and you go, no, all of these things are still right. And it's all the things I've been doing, but I've hit this roadblock. I don't know what to do. And I think those are the moments that really our faith comes into play more than any other time.
Yeah.
And you go, I am going to choose to just keep walking forward. I'm just going to take another step, and I'm going to wake up tomorrow and I'm going to keep walking forward. And we've talked about that with people going through depression or whatever. Sometimes the miracle is that you woke up that day, you got dressed, and you went to work or whatever it is. It may seem so small, but if you want to be strong in the Lord, there are those moments when you are weak and you just keep going.
Yeah.
And the Lord will, those seasons hopefully don't last too long, but at the same time, there's just this divine stubbornness when we're following the Lord to go, I know what the world is telling me to do is not right. I know it's going to lead to nothing but death. I'm looking at the Lord, but I'm not feeling like I used to feel. I'm just going to choose to keep walking in this path. And I think to me, that was the main thing I was going to pull out of the life of Joseph. He, in Potiphar's house, Potiphar goes, I see that the Lord is with you and that everything you do prospers. He is working hard in a situation that he could easily just give up on life and go, I had a great family and they threw me in the pit and my life is terrible. He never gives into that. He doesn't give into the victimhood thing. He just keeps working hard wherever he's at, and the Lord elevates him in the time that he's called to. So I think that's important in strengthening ourselves in the Lord.
And shameless plug. If you want to hear the sermon that Ryan didn't get to preach in written format on Joseph, I think you unpack that quite a bit in your book, Head in the Clouds, Feet on the Ground, which is a great book. I just read it recently. If you didn't know, Ryan has written a couple books. He has, and they're great. So,
I like.
Thank you. I'm turning red and sweating, but
I know. You
the concept with Joseph, we used the word buoyancy. That was a word that when we talk about strengthening yourself in the Lord, it's like trying to create obviously resilience, and you brought that out with the moms. But this idea of buoyancy. To where there's something about the saints, there's something about the people of God to where whatever ends up knocking them down or taking them to the bottom, if you just wait long enough, it's like they've got life, they've got buoyancy, they've got a life jacket. Life pulls us down, and then you just hang on to Jesus, and all of a sudden it's like, what's happening? We're back up. And then sure enough, somehow the world tries to get you down. In this world you have tribulation, but take heart, I've overcome the world.
And when in doubt, just stay close to Jesus, because he's the author and perfecter of our faith. So I think so many ways we try to perfect our own faith, and it's true. We should walk in that as much as we can. But there are those moments where it's like, all I could do is just pray and stay close to Jesus, and in those moments the Lord takes you into where he wants you, and you find yourself coming up to the surface.
And there is no end to the depths at which that buoyancy in the Lord can find you. I'm reading a book recently where they was quoting a little snippet out of Corrie Ten Boom's book, where she talks about how her and her sister, right, at one point in time they were in a concentration camp, and they got fleas in their room.
I just read that story this morning. This is shocking. Are we reading the Pete Greig? Yeah, that's what it is.
It's a great book. Pete Greig's book on how to pray. Which I remember I read The Hiding Place just a year or two ago. Which both of those books, read all the books.
So good.
But they get fleas in their room. And they're just, her sister is just like this, obnoxiously full of the Spirit, focused on the things of the Lord, optimist person, right? And Corey is thinking, well, how are we going to be grateful for the fleas? We've been thanking for the Lord for every little blessing, but here we have the fleas, and her sister's like, well, God, I'm grateful for the fleas. And come to find out that because of the fleas in their room, the guards no longer wanted to enter their room. So now all of a sudden they have a time for privacy and a place to have Bible studies. And they're thinking, great, thanks for the fleas, Lord.
In a concentration camp. It makes me feel, whenever I read something like that, I'm like, okay, Lord, that's buoyancy right there.
Another word that in this, going to the second time I preached was the idea of dunamis. I love the buoyancy concept, and and that's what Ryan was going to preach. But but the dunamis concept, and that came from Paul's life, the book of Acts, where he was filled with the rage. He was breathing out murderous threats, and that was like the fuel of his life. And we talked about how fuel's a big deal these days in our society. Like, where are we getting fuel? What's the best fuel? Energy.
For a 10-gallon tank.
Gas is so expensive. And there's that. I mean, strengthening yourself in the Lord, figuring out how to tap into the dunamis of the Lord. And that's that Greek word for power that Paul loves to use in all of his run-on sentences. But it's just that dunamis. And he was hit by that, so he was filled with a power that was, righteous indignation, religious zeal, maybe father wounds. We don't know exactly all those things, but at some point on the way to Damascus to go and persecute the church, he was hit by something that knocked him down. And he was like, who are you? And I'm Jesus, whom you're persecuting. And so then, Paul became someone who, began to grow in his relationship with Jesus, whom he was persecuting. And he began to find, like, in his weakness, he was strong. There was something he could tap into. And again, even saying that is a little bit careful, because it's not like some sort of magic thing, or like, like really look at your belly button long enough and then you will actually be in this place. But it's the power of God. And that's something that, Kurt Cotter, Pastor Kurt around here, it's so fun, because that guy is so hungry for dunamis. That's all he wants. He's just like, where's the dunamis? I want dunamis. I want to see it. I want to know it, experience. And I love that. And, and we didn't get tons. I mean, obviously I said, here are a few things that we see in Paul's life and Paul's teaching, that if you want to see the power of God show up in your life, preach the gospel. Because for Paul, the power of God, is found in the gospel. And if you want to see the power of God, don't try and escape pain or brokenness. Like, sit in those moments like Joseph and see what the Lord does. And if you want to see the power of God, stand against evil. And so that was because of practice thing. But in the back of my mind, there was, just a whole lot more teaching on the Spirit of God and our relationship with the Holy Spirit, because that is the power of God, And again, we didn't get into it much, but just like baptism of the Spirit, indwelling of the Spirit, the Spirit is with us. Those three different relationships we see in the New Testament, but that whole concept, wait on the Father and the promise will come. What is the promise? That the power will come and you will be my witnesses. And that leads to the manifestations of the power of God, the manifestations of the Spirit. And again, we didn't get too into it, but we hunger for those things. We want to see, speaking in tongues with interpretation for the edification of saints. We want to see miraculous signs, whatever that means, And sometimes I think the most miraculous thing that God can manifest in our lives is forgiveness. I think that might be the hardest miracle there is. But gifts of healing, prophecy, all that, faith, boldness, all the different things, like. We long to see the power of God show up in the manifestations of the Spirit, but we long to see the power of God show up, in all these other ways that we're describing as well, just to sustain us, just to help us love our wives, help us love our children, help us to stay faithful in times of adversity. Like, we are so desperate for the power of God, but I didn't really get to go into that place of the manifestation, but that is a part of the dunamis for sure.
And I think when you said the gospel too is just so important. And we've talked a lot about, you've told me before, you said, if I give a bad sermon, but I've got communion, at least I can wrap it up with communion. Like, it's one of those things, it's a catch-all. And we've all, some sermons were like, yes, I felt like in the zone, others we didn't. But then there's those moments where it's like, but when we take communion together, something really beautiful happens, because we're all reminding ourselves of the gospel and why we're there. And the gospel is the power of God working. It is the key to receiving the gift of the Holy Spirit that gives us strength when we need strength the most. And it's not just a philosophy. It's not just good Bible memorization. The Spirit of God living in us is an amazing miracle. And it gives us enough strength that we need in those sort of seasons. And that's the miracle of following Jesus, right? We have God dwelling inside of us. What an awesome thing.
I think I can think of one last thing that's worth chatting about, which is really beautiful that we haven't even mentioned so far. Mario.
Mario. Yes.
Mario Benavides. So we have
Mario, not the Italian Nintendo guy.
No, not Mario and Luigi.
There was no Luigi. Ecuadorian
Mario. Yeah.
Man, David, tell us about that. That was a beautiful
Oh
song.
my
so
goodness, that felt like a long dream that finally came to pass. And in Mario's message, he was able to share that, for 10 years, and it was so funny. He was like, 10 years ago, I was like, the Lord is good. We're going to Arizona to plant a church. My wife is with me. My kids are with me. The Lord is with me.
Yep.
Yeah. And obviously the whole thing was bilingual. So then Mario says that in Spanish with all that emotion. And then the translator in English does all the same emotion. And they were going so fast. It was
translated.
It was awesome. And then he translated the and then he's like, and then 9 years ago we were like, yeah, we got this. And then 8 years ago when there was all this, it was like, yeah. And then 6 years or 4 years ago, he's like, pandemic.
Yeah.
And we were like, and then he just kind of went through that. And then he was like, and then, he's got his visa now. His kids getting enrolled in school. We're looking for a home for them right now. And, probably come September, they're going to be actually launching some sort of living streams in Spanish. And so he's lived the last 10 years of this process more than any of us. But for us, we've lived it too. And seeing our sanctuary filled with Spanish and English interplaying together in a way that honored the Lord and was easily accessible.
Yes.
It was just like it was just a yes and amen.
Yeah.
It was like, thank you, Lord. We want to figure out what integration means in your kingdom, not uniformity, but unity. Yeah. And there's a total precious, massive Latino community that is surrounding us. That's all over. Yeah. And we have many Latinos that have been showing up in the last few years, and it's been wonderful in English and all those things. But it's funny, after that Sunday, many of them were coming up and saying, my parents would love this. They need this so bad. Yeah. So their parents are not as bilingual. They're more Spanish first and some English to get by. Yeah. Their kids are, probably bilingual, maybe 50-50, but maybe a little bit more English first. And yet they know a lot of people who are primarily Spanish first. So it was like a window opened, and it was just like kingdom breeze just flew.
Well, and one of the things that Mario, it wasn't necessarily the content of his message, but what he brought, he embodied something I think that does strengthen us in the Lord. And we haven't really talked about it much, but community. I mean, one of the things that was pulled from us in 2020 was community. And we had digital community, and you're responsible for that, doing an awesome job. Yeah. But there's something that's lacking when the people of God can't be together, But I think even the next level of that expression would be the bilingual service that we experience, where it's like not just unity in this room, but it was a reminder that the kingdom is so much bigger than what's just happening here at Central and Glendale. It's a lot bigger than just what's going on in America, or, it's in different languages. It's all over the place. And Mario embodied that. And I think there was a unity in the room. As soon as Edwin started singing in Spanish, it was like everything. I knew it. I was like, I think something's going to happen, but I wasn't sure what it was going to be. As soon as he sang in Spanish, I felt like something shifted. And I couldn't write down philosophically why I think it happened. It just felt like the Spirit moved in a new way right in that moment. And I knew, I'm like, we're on the right path. The Lord has laid this out. 10 years ago, he knew he assigned Mario, but the timing of it was just right. We didn't push it too fast. Yeah. When it was the right timing of the Lord, this expression of community that we have that's so beautiful and wonderful, and I love living streams, but it even expanded a little bit more and
God
reminded
got bigger.
me. Yes.
That's what, for that worship time, I was beautiful. Like, he's not an English God.
Yeah.
He's not limited to English like I am.
And we know that.
He's
we all,
bigger,
we do missions. The three of us have done a lot of missions. We all know that, again, in our head. Yeah. But in that moment, it was like in our home, in a Sunday that I'm so familiar seeing happen a certain way, it was beautiful to see the Lord kind of widen our vision.
Well, and I remember chatting with Yanni, one of the women in our church is Colombian, a little while later, and she said it felt like home came home. And I get that. I mean, obviously English is my primary language, but I have had so many encounters with the Lord. It different parts of the world worshiping the Lord in different languages. And it was just really cool to see something that I've seen in other churches that, have to be bilingual because that's the makeup of where they are in the world. Yeah. But to see that come home to Living Streams is the thing that we're stretching to do, but we don't have to do.
Yeah.
But to say, actually, we really love all of the community around us, and we really care for the people in our community who don't speak English as much as we do for the people who do speak English. And so we want to bring this unity. And I love the reality that the thing is that the church is the place of diversity and community in a real way.
Sure.
Not in a fake way, not in a make sure that we get the right people rostered, to look like it, not in a stock footage way. So it looks like, you got, but in a, like, we actually have unity in the Spirit. And it's a real thing. And when you encounter that, it's beautiful. And I love that. My favorite, there were a lot of favorite parts about that Sunday. One of my many favorite parts of that Sunday was what happened with the majority of the people in the congregation, who obviously are English speaking and don't speak Spanish, whenever you'd hit the chorus in Spanish. Yeah. Because it was like, during the verses, you got the Spanish speakers who were going nuts like they've never gone before. Yeah. And the English speakers kind of, and then you were trying,
I don't know how they fit those syllables. I don't know how they fit the syllables. I was trying to hit it.
Oh man, it was, and it just, to me, it was like such a communication of like, yes, I'm in it. Like, no, I'm not annoyed that I don't speak Spanish. Yes, I'm excited to worship God in a language I don't even understand.
Yes, absolutely.
That was beautiful.
And we got to lean in, Living Streams. It's going to stretch us. It's going to change us, but it's all for the good and for the right. And Mario's message, as far as strengthen yourself in the Lord, it was just so cool that he just, took that and ran with it. And the whole idea of waiting on the Lord. Wait on the Lord, and he, and he will strengthen your heart. And he used the image of Isaiah 40, I think. But those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They'll mount up on wings like eagles. And that's what it was saying. It was like, for 10 years, I just keep waiting. And I can't tell you the strength that me and my family feel right now after this waiting time. Like, we're just, like, he's so pumped right now. It's so fun. And, but that, it took a long time of waiting. For sure.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts? We've squeezed it.
Well, the only last thing that I would say is just strengthening yourself. And this isn't a self-centered thing. This isn't a, you are the most important thing in the world. That there's a careful trick there, but I just, what we didn't get across, I don't know too much. I said it in the beginning, but it's just we've got to figure out how to not be reliant on somebody else for a relationship with the Lord. And in some ways, it's like the manna came to each person in the Exodus, right, in the wilderness. And you're just supposed to get the manna for you. You know, and you couldn't get manna for the next day, and you weren't supposed to get manna for the person next to you. And I feel like with podcasts, with the teachings, with church, rhythms that we do, I mean, we need to glean from others for sure. We need to drink from other streams in that regard. But at the end of the day, the true treasure, the true riches, the true food you need comes from one place and one place only, and that's you and Jesus.
Yes, absolutely.
You and Jesus in those quiet spaces. You got to figure out how to strengthen yourself in the Lord.
Yes.
So that you can strengthen somebody else in the Lord. And the the image of the airline, right? Like put on your own mask before you serve those others. Again, we can't get to a place where we're only focused on putting on our own mask. It's put on your own mask so that you can serve others. And the American kind of ideology right now is everyone needs to be really paying attention to their own mask. But they're not serving anyone else.
But they're not putting anyone else's mask.
But there is some truth to that, and that's to strengthen yourself in the Lord. Like to cultivate that ability, to cultivate that relationship in prayer, in worship, in Bible study, and then aligning yourself in the will of God.
And rhythms, and I think this may be one other thing that we didn't quite touch on, but Sabbath and rest and good rhythm. And we were talking about it this morning, but mental health through the vision of through the lens of Philippians, the book of Philippians. And mental health is one of those things that I think can come from this place of just worry about yourself, spend all your time making sure you don't feel uncomfortable or, that, and that's not what we're talking about. But there are very practical things. You might go, I can't hear from the Lord. And you go, well, have you had a day off of work at all this week? Well, no. And there's some very practical things. And even for those of us, like I go see a counselor, not because I'm in an emergency, but because I don't want to get into an emergency. And there's just healthy habits like that too. Yeah, proactive. And it is part of that, putting that mask on yourself. And I've realized that if I go home and I've burned all my energy at work, and then I go home and yell at my kids, it's because I was not very disciplined with my day, and I burned all my good fuel at work, and I had nothing for my kids.
Priorities out of whack.
Priorities, and so
you're seeing, this is just such an important caveat, I think, for me to highlight. You're seeing a good, wise Christian counselor.
Yes, a biblically based counselor, which is not always the case.
Because there are so many counselors these days that will lead you in the exact wrong direction. But there is something so vital to having a man or woman of God who is listening to the Lord and helping you have a backboard, have a sounding board, and have perspective and pointing you in the direction of the Lord.
And we'll unpack that in the fall and a lot more specifics in that. But I think just in general, we have to take care of ourselves, and not a selfish way, but in a way that leaves you fuel to hear from the Lord. Take care of your kids and your family that's around you, your friends, making sure that you have the right priorities. And one of I think the top reasons why people feel so exhausted and they don't have anything left, even in the Christian community, is that they don't do those practical things that the Lord gave us. He's already given us those principles of rest. We just have to listen to him, So.
Well, great. Thank you guys. Appreciate it. Thank you guys for tracking with us. It's been a long podcast and you're still here. You're
has been
watching.
Long.
Yeah, we mentioned a handful of books. We'll leave links in the description. Also, you might not know this, but at livingstreams.org/library, we have like a large list of different book recommendations. You can always go there, search by different topics. You can even see who recommended the book. And I think most, if not all, of the books that we mentioned today are at livingstreams.org/library. So thank you so much for being with us. It's meant a lot for us to just have a congregation that is tracking with us as we talk about strengthening ourselves in the Lord. And we want to continue to do that. The year is not over yet. We're not done talking about strengthening ourselves in the Lord. We're right now working through the book of Job. We'll be talking about some more stuff in the future. And let's get strong in the Lord as individuals, as a community, as a family. And we'll see you the next time we're done with the series.